So you lived in China for 3.5 years. Could you share any insights into life in China that might surprise Western audiences and challenge any misconceptions that are promoted in the, mainstream Western media?
Yeah, I think I should probably start by saying it was quite a long time ago. I lived in China in 2004 for 6 months and then from 2007 to 2010. So even the more recent period, I've not actually been in China for 15 years. And the development since has been extraordinary. So most of the high-speed rail stuff was just beginning really when I was there. And I remember the journey time between Beijing and Shanghai being sort of halved overnight. And I think it's further reduced since. But now there wasn't this enormous network of high-speed rail that now exists across China. I also remember pollution being a big issue when I was there and seeing, a lot of dirt, a lot of bad air quality, rubbish, and so on, clogging up streams and so on. And from what I've heard from friends who've been to China much more recently, it's a much cleaner country now. I think there's been a real shift under Xi Jinping towards ecological civilization, a real effort to kind of clean up the big cities and so on. So I'm looking forward to going back and seeing how much has changed because I think even between 2004 and 2009, just the pace of development was so fast. I was a student in China in 2004 in a suburb of Beijing called Wudao, and I didn't live in Beijing subsequently. I lived in Dalian and Ningbo, but I returned to Wudao at one point just to see the old neighborhood, and it was completely unrecognizable. In 5 years, everything had changed. So that's how quickly this country has been developing. And that leads on to one of the most striking aspects of living in China for somebody from Britain was just how optimistic it was. People felt that life was getting better. They could remember when things were harder than they were today. They expected tomorrow to be better than today. And so it was a really optimistic society. And in Britain, it's more or less the opposite of that. People with quite good reason say life was easier 30, 40, 50 years ago. People had better social security. People could go to university for free. Now you have to pay for it. The average price of a house in Britain in the 70s was, I think, 3 times the average annual wage, whereas now it's something like 9 or 10 times the average annual wage. So optimism was a really novel aspect of China for me. I think in terms of misconceptions, I mean, there are so many, but one of them would be this idea that China is some kind of repressive state where people can't speak freely and so on. I had loads of Chinese friends over there, and there was no hesitation about, there was lively debate on politics. There was debate in the Chinese media about politics as well. There were different political opinions expressed in different papers and so on. And there was never this idea people were worried about what they would say. And there was plenty of criticism of the government and the Communist Party as well on specific issues. So, there's lively engagement with citizens in China, with the political system, and with local decision making. I think it's such a different system from the British one that in some cases, if you haven't lived there, it's quite hard to imagine. And an example that I often give is that a friend of mine who was a French expat living in Ningbo, he had a bar and he wanted to expand his bar and turn it into a restaurant. And the process to get approval for that involved a meeting of the entire neighborhood, essentially. And the police came to that meeting, but only to stop any kind of fights breaking out between people. They didn't intervene in the meeting. And there was a long argument about whether or not the bar should be allowed to expand. And at the end, the decision was no, the locals don't want a larger venue here. And my French friend was quite bewildered. He said, but it's not against the law. I checked all of these regulations. There's nothing to prevent me from doing it in the law. But the answer from the local planning officials was, in China, it doesn't just matter about whether it's legal or not. You have to have the consent of the community to expand in this way. Now, of course, we see examples where that's subverted in one way or another. There are cases where people are bribed or bullied into agreeing to things they don't really want to agree with. And that's an issue which the Chinese system tries to deal with. Corruption and so on have been a big focus of Xi Jinping's efforts to kind of root out that type of thing. But it was an example of local democratic power being exercised in a way which you can't exercise it in that way in Britain. We don't have the structures that allow that. And certainly planning law. You talk to people about the way consultations around planning projects work in Britain. They're very geared towards approving anything big developers want overriding the wishes of the local population. There was also a much more, in the way that people are brought up, a much more collectivist attitude to resolving problems rather than a kind of a hierarchical top-down one. And an example I'd give of that is when I was working as a teacher in Ningbo, there was a problem in the school with a girl who was being bullied. And in a Western school, that would be the responsibility of the staff to look into that. But I mentioned my concerns to another member of staff, and they said, well, what you've got to do if you think something's wrong is you've got to go to the Young Communist League because they are embedded among the pupils of the school. And it's their responsibility to take care of these kind of issues and make sure that, they're resolved. It shouldn't be the people in authority doing it. It should be resolved by the students themselves. And so I reported it to the Young Communist League lead for my class, who was a very bright student. And she just said, yeah, we'll have a look into it. And they did, and they found out what was going on. They brought everyone together. They talked to the people and they resolved the issue. And again, it's a completely different mentality to the one that we would see in a British school, and quite an empowering one. I think now that China's being portrayed again as a kind of wicked communist adversary, we also need to tackle the various myths about communism in general as this kind of joyless, authoritarian political dictatorship that is built up in the Western imagination. But China is a country with a really vibrant civil society, a huge scientific leader in all those fields that I was mentioning before, but also some of the best museums in the world, some of the best really kind of attention being paid now to national parks and culture and internal tourism. There's a huge celebration of Chinese culture. And there's a British author and producer of TV programs, Michael Wood, who I believe is the president of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, maybe. I might check that. I believe he might be the president of that society. But anyway, Michael Wood is an author who's written books about history of China. He's written a book about the poet Du Fu. And in the latter book, he talks about traveling around China and going to historic sites which are associated with Du Fu, who is an 8th century Chinese poet of the Tang dynasty. And he finds that, there are poetry clubs everywhere. There are these societies dedicated to visiting these sites. He goes to one of the poetry clubs and it's in a small town. It has 1,000 members and they're working class. These are people who work on farms. They're people who work in factories, and they're all going to these poetry clubs to talk about Du Fu and so on. And he finds ones where they try and recreate the ancestral music that used to accompany these poems as well. And I went to a talk by Michael Wood in Gloucester, and he said he tried to pitch this amazing story about these songs because there's a possibility that the melodies and so on go all the way back to the Tang dynasty. We can't be sure, but they've been passed down through families for centuries and centuries. And he thought it would make a really interesting documentary. And he said, no, the BBC now will not fund a documentary on China that portrays it in a positive light. So he was told we can't get funding for a project like this. It wasn't a political project. It wouldn't have defended the Chinese Communist Party or said anything political, but because it would have created an impression of China as this place of culture, a place where people have leisure time, where people, have hobbies and join clubs and things, that wasn't welcome. So I think that tells you how much effort the British authorities are actually putting into hiding the reality of what China is like. And I know I mentioned earlier this issue with the brain drain from Taiwan. On that question, this flood of Chinese students around the world, if China was worried about its own political system, if it was worried that people didn't see it as legitimate, why would it be so relaxed about millions of Chinese people traveling the world, going and living and studying in the United States, Britain, and so on? It's not bothered by that. They're not worried that people are going to think, well, I'm really envious of the British or American political systems. And I think we can see ourselves why people might not think so much of the British political system after living here for a few years. But it's actually Western governments that are increasingly frightened of Western people being exposed to Chinese people. It's not the other way around. And that tells you something about how actually misleading all of this anti-China propaganda is. It's a very open society, a very culturally flourishing and advanced society. And I'm really looking forward to visiting it again.